anytime, any day. Why not right now? Stop looking up to your boss and start being your own boss. Don't work for paychecks. Work for dreams with no regrets. This is Cracking the Entrepreneur Code. If you have the passion, we'll create the blueprint. Now, your host. You know him from his 7 tips to build the business you always wanted, and now you're about to hear a lot more. Jack H.M. Wong.
Welcome, and welcome to another episode of Cracking the Entrepreneur Code podcast show. I'm your host, Jack Wong. Today, I've got another expert coming on board, and his name is Jim Mosquera. So just give you a little bit background of Jim. Jim is actually having a degree in industrial engineering, and he has a business background in telecommunications and networking, and he has self-developed knowledge of economics and the financial markets. He is the principal at Sentinel Consulting, a small business financing and debt restructuring firm. He's also an author, but he's a non-fiction author which has published 3 non-fiction books. So Jim, thank you very much for agreeing to be on my show. How are you today?
Hey Jack, thanks a lot for having me on.
Yes, because you came with a very interesting background. Like I have a guest previously on my show, and he talks about cash flow. So cash flow is very important for small business owner. And you actually hit the nail of another very important topic called financing. Because the topic today we want to talk about is small business financing is not what it used to be. So what I believe is that what I learned in terms of financing a decade ago would have been different from now. So I'm very curious what exactly this latest financing is all about. And I just want to give you a little bit background of what's going on in business owner from Asia. There is a complaint like Singapore, which is where I'm from. I have got just a week ago, the government of Singapore announced a budget. And the budget announcement is always trying to help the small business owners because they said, well, government, you've got to help me. I can't raise finances, so you as the government, you've got to help me to find opportunities for me, to help me source for business opportunity. You know what basically it's like, government, you have the obligation to help me or else I would not be able to survive. I don't know the context in other parts of the world, but you know what? I am always struggling with why the small business owners have difficulty in raising the finance. So I would like to really ask you some of these questions later on. But you said you have an industrial engineering background to start with, and now you are doing financing. So how do you start this journey, by the way?
Well, I guess more than a few years ago, I did. I got my bachelor's and master's in industrial engineering with a specialty in operations research, which is really a fancy way of using applied mathematics to solve business problems. So I always had a very strong interest in businesses and how businesses ran, did well in math in high school, so that made me a good candidate, I guess, to proceed through engineering school. And that's why I pursued industrial engineering. Industrial engineering does a good job of bridging that chasm, if you will, between the hard engineering science and then, you know, how businesses work and try to solve business problems. Of course, that's what engineers do. We solve problems. After I graduated from college, I went to work in the telecommunications field, which was interesting because I never really got to apply anything that I studied in my engineering program per se. And I began working in telecommunications, was kind of at the forefront of a lot of the technological developments that you see today that what we call the internet. So, companies connecting to the internet or connecting their own internal networks. I was very, very involved with that. About 4 years ago, I started a consultancy called Sentinel Consulting, which has 3 main pillars to it. It has general business consulting, it has alternative finance, as you mentioned in your intro, and then it has something called debt restructuring and debt mediation. So those disciplines, Jack, are focused primarily on the small to mid-sized market.
That's very interesting. Transitioning from industrial engineering to what you're doing right now as a business consultant. Have you ever dreamt of being a consultant when you were in school?
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that because after I had started to work in the telecommunications firm, I was being pursued by someone in a consulting company. I literally was about 1 or 2 days away from resigning my post in the telecommunications firm firm I was in and going to work for this consultancy. And I got a call literally out of the blue one day asking me if I wanted to be part of this Inc. program within the large company I was part of. So I was going to be basically developing a small business based on emerging technologies within this larger organization. So I thought it was a really neat opportunity to pursue. So I chose that path instead. It's really interesting how certain happen in your life and the direction it can take you.
That's very interesting. And I guess that like sometimes when opportunity comes in, and it's true irresistible to say no, especially when the time is right, when you are not enjoying what you do, and somehow there's another opportunity which is more excited, then you just jump to that opportunity. I mean, that's what life is all about, right? I guess. That's why. So in this company called Sentinel Consulting, you mentioned the 3 pillars. So you mentioned the 3 pillars, basically the general business consulting and debt restructuring and alternative financing. Can you kindly elaborate what these 3 pillars are, because I just want to make sure that my audiences are able to understand.
Sure. When I founded this consultancy, I guess 4 years ago now, I wanted to focus on those things that I thought were essential for small to mid-sized business growth and vibrant. And, you know, one of the things I think of from the studies within the United States is that small business is the engine of economic growth. My guess is it's probably the same anywhere in the world. And so what do you need to do to make those small to mid-sized companies economically vibrant? Well, the first pillar is general business consulting. And what I try to do there are identify things that may impair cash flow in an organization. And sometimes it may be looking at financials. But again, since I have a technology background, I can look at things that are technologically oriented and point out perhaps deficiencies that then need to be followed up on maybe by some of my business partners. I'm not an accountant, but I can tell enough about, you know, someone's accounting statements to know that there may be a problem there. I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell sometimes that there may be some potential legal problems ahead. So the first pillar is really all about identification of problems and the potential for their correction. The second pillar is, as you mentioned, alternative finance in the intro. And alternative finance means, at least in the United States, avenues for small to mid-sized business owners to pursue for capital acquisition that lie outside of the traditional commercial banking system. And that's something that really came to the fore after the financial crisis of 2008, where bankers who were normally fairly risk averse became even more so. And at least in the United States, there's a regulatory layer now that's applied over the commercial banking system that really makes it more challenging for small to mid-sized businesses to acquire capital and credit. And so what that did is it spawned a boutique industry, if you will. In that, the third pillar is what I'll call debt mediation and debt restructuring. Sometimes decisions, that first pillar, which again, something that they decided or something that's not, that's impairing their cash flow or cash flow leaks early on, can lead to problems later, as well as maybe not having a good capital plan. If you have a business that's struggling, well, what can they do to arrest those struggles? If they're growing, do they come up with a good financing plan to accommodate that growth? So the third pillar really focuses on companies that are now in trouble because of debt reasons. And when they find themselves in trouble, they need to do some debt restructuring, or in the case that they're facing civil litigation in the United States because of the debt problem, they need some debt mediation, because in the United States anyway, debt problems do not resolve themselves in court. So really when the problem arises in court, it's become a legal problem, but it's really a legal problem in search of a financial resolution. So that's what I try to do in the third pillar.
That's very interesting, because typically like small business owners may find that, okay, I've got a problem, and at the same time, I don't like the culture that we have in Asia is that they don't really want to talk about. It takes a very strong courage for somebody to approach you guys to ask for help. Like, how do you get your clients like that?
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought that up, Jack, because when they find themselves in need of that third pillar, which is debt mediation and debt restructuring, there's a lot of pride that's involved in terms of opening up yourself to really a stranger potentially, right? And revealing your problems. Oftentimes, there may be a crossover or a bleed over that your personal finances, particularly for many small business owners, bleed over into the business side. And it's hard to separate the two. And so, the acquisition of clients really has to come through a lot of solid relationship making, networking, and really presenting yourself to your local community or even broader community as a trusted advisor. Even when I was working in the telecommunications field and I had an organization for which I was responsible, I always wanted to make sure my people position themselves not even just as a trusted advisor, but an entrusted advisor. So that's a higher level of trust. And when you hire a consultant to look at a small to mid-sized business, you're really placing a great deal of trust, which is different than if you're working in a large corporation where you may or may not have that same level of skin in the game, and certainly not the degree of ownership that you would in a small to mid-sized company.
And how do you build this trust with the people? Like the general thing I can imagine is that, okay, Jim, you are a business consultant. I heard you provide solutions to help these small, medium business owners in terms of restructuring their debt. I heard you. So how are you different from other business consultants doing the same thing?
Well, the business proposition, particularly on the debt restructuring, is really twofold. As I mentioned, when those problems arrive in civil court here in the United States, there's really only one possible outcome to these cases, and that's usually the plaintiff, which is, again, the creditor, is going to win that case in court. And so if the defendant, again, the small business owner, chooses to fight that, there's going to really not be again, it's a judicial problem, it's a legal problem, but it's really in search of a financial resolution. Typically, the attorneys involved there are not going to analyze it from a financial perspective, and they may try to do some other things that end up potentially being more costly for all parties involved.
Right.
And what I tell everyone, which is something that oftentimes gets overlooked, Jack, is even when the plaintiff, that creditor, wins in court, it means that the law has recognized judicially that yes, that you have a piece of paper now that affirms that yes, the small business owner absolutely owes you this, and the court says now that small business owner is going to be responsible for the debt, probably interest charges and penalties, and not only that, but the plaintiff attorney as well. So even after that judicial conclusion, there's still no money that's been exchanged.
Exactly.
So the value proposition for both parties is to have some amount of money that gets exchanged between the two parties. For the creditor, it represents having something that perhaps may not then drive that small business owner into bankruptcy or some sort of liquidation. And for the small business owner, it means that they may live to fight another day.
Right. Because you hit the nail of the thread about litigation. First of all, we all acknowledge that United States is the most aggressive country, if I were to put that, because this is from my experience in terms of litigation. Whereas I study law and learned that in the other parts of the world, we don't really like to litigate in court because, like you said, really, so what if I win the case if the other guy has no money to pay? So it's kind of like a waste of time. So therefore, it is very, very popular in our parts of the world, something called alternative dispute resolution or arbitration. So which is like, okay, instead of putting the matters to the court and let the court decide what's the outcome, can we sort out within ourselves and see what we can do to make sure that we have a win-win situation? So I guess that's the reason why sometimes, these business owners may want you guys to step in because, is it worthy pursuing the judicial route? It may not, because I may not have money to pay plaintiff. So what's the point? So I believe that it is a very niche market, and yet you guys are providing a very useful solution to this small business owner. I have another question in my mind. Knowing that this is a very niche market, like I always believe that there are lots of small business owners, but in terms of your practice, is that a very niche market to tackle? Why don't you consider going for other types of business owners, but small and business owners?
Yeah, and part of the reason for that is in the United States, when we typically hear about debt restructuring, we understand that, and it's publicized on a much more grander scale. So as an example, in the United States, most recently, one of the largest, children's toys retailers called Toys R Us, they declared bankruptcy. It was a restructuring bankruptcy, so it's a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Now they stay open during that time frame, and it's a court-appointed process where you have a lot of resources that come to bear to try to resolve the bankruptcy. So creditors are satisfied to some degree. Well, that's a very expensive process. Toys R Us is a very, very large company, but for the small to mid-sized business owner, if they were to face something like that, it's very, very unlikely that they would go through a Chapter 11 process because, again, the cost and the complexity associated with it. And a Chapter 11 process takes a while to resolve. And so the goal with these efforts is to bring sort of that same discipline to a small to mid-sized business debt solution, but without the rigors, if you will, of a Chapter 11 that you've got, armies of attorneys, accountants, and certainly court mediation that's part of it. So, yeah, it is a very, very niche market, and it's targeted to preserve, if you will, that small to mid-sized business owner. Again, if you believe that they're the engine of economic growth, we need to do everything we can to preserve them. And if I could add one note, I wrote an article that showed, at least in the United States, a very disturbing trend where since 2009, we're actually seeing more business deaths in the United States than we are seeing business births. So what that's doing is collapsing that lower part of the economy, if you will, where jobs kind of get organically created. And so the effect of that is to throw more potential employees into larger organizations, or as we see in the economic statistics, we've got a larger number of people simply not participating in the labor force. So that's not a good thing either. So we need to do everything we can to encourage and maintain small business growth because, again, the trends in the United States right now are not positive for that effect.
I just want to ask another question that suddenly just came to my mind because I serve business owners in Asia. And typically, while I do tax consulting work, and I always tell people that, you know what, the small business owners will not come to me because no matter how much I want to educate them to be aware of the tax problems, they don't see that until the problem arises. Like, do you guys actually provide education before the problem arises? Or have you been busy over years to actually solve the problems because the problem has already happened?
Yeah, great question. Yes. I guess one resolution to that would be to conduct some seminars here locally for small businesses. That would be one. But I'd like to think that the first pillar that I mentioned, which is small business consultancy, if you go to my website at sentinelconsulting.biz, you'll see some video skits that I made with a partner of mine. And in the first skit, the small business owner is very eager to make a decision about something. And then I'm sitting across the table from her and I tell her, hey, you need to think about some things. And that's really what that first pillar is all about, is making some good decisions now so you don't run into those problems later. Because there's some very, very, and I've seen this time and time again. In fact, I was having a meeting with a small business owner a couple of weeks ago, and small business owner was contemplating expanding their business. Got introduced to the small business owner through their accountant. I told the small business owner that I would, propose a consulting arrangement to kind of really understand whether now was the right time to expand. And this is a question that is very, very key in the life cycle of this business, because if they make the wrong decision now, there's going to be some adverse consequences later, particularly if they don't have the cash flow for that expansion that they so desperately want. So very, very important, those decisions that get made very early on in a business's life cycle.
That's right. So education is still important, but if some business owners just choose not to listen or just ignore it and go ahead with the plan, they have to bear the consequences, and that's where the other pillar comes in to help them to fix the problem. Okay, so I will just shift the gear to a little bit about the other things that you provided me. You shared with me that you're actually a non-fiction author and you published 3 non-fiction books. Can you just share with us, what books have you published?
The non-fiction series, Jack, is under the title of Escaping Oz. So there's 3 books of Escaping Oz. The first 2 are focus on the financial markets and the economy of the United States. They were the first one was written a little bit after the financial crisis in the United States around 2010. And part of what I did there is to kind of show the origins, if you will, of our problems, why they really haven't been resolved, if you will. And I say resolved as, again, remember my background is in engineering. So if I see a problem, I'm looking for its resolution. Well, when I see it from an economic perspective or financial perspective, and I see, okay, we really haven't resolved anything. We've just kind of put a Band-Aid over it for now. And we've stopped the bleeding, if you will, but there's still a lot of pressure building up in that blood vessel underneath that Band-Aid's not going to hold when the blood vessel bursts, right? So I'm giving you that metaphor as an example of, what I see. And so that's why I wrote the first 2 Escaping Oz books. They're really focused on the financial markets, the economy, what you need to do to kind of preserve yourself and your well-being, when the next financial crisis arrives. And really what you need to do from, at least from a community perspective, because here in the United States, we've grown very reliant on a large federal government to kind of take care of things, when problems occur. And that's what I talked about in my latest Escaping Oz book, which I was really happy with the way I did it. It's called Escaping Oz, An Observer's Reflections. And what it is, it's organized like a regular book, but within each chapter, I made it a lot of series of like very, very short articles. So you can go into a chapter, pick out an article you want to read, and 5 minutes later you're done. And I did that primarily because, at least in the United States, there seems to be a reluctance for people to read and sit down and learn things. Yep. And so I did it in that fashion to give people small chunks of information. But really the gist of the book is how we've asked government, at least federal government, to do so much for us, but statistically, we know we've asked them to do too much because the funded debt of the United States now is some 21 trillion and growing. And so we've asked government to do all these things, but at the same time, we have all of these unintended consequences as a result of what we've asked government to do. And, let's face it, sometimes those consequences not only affect individuals, but small businesses like we're talking about today.
Well, I know that the United States is the leading economy, and whatever the world is going on has a lot to do with the current president of the United States. I mean, we are not going to the politics on this. That can be the topic of another time. So I'm not going to that in detail. But I always believe that, because my background is that I don't really depend a lot on what the government is going to do or to save me, because at the end, I have to be the first one to save myself. So to me, it's like I need to know what I have to know, so that when the financial crisis is coming, which I know is a matter of time, at least I'm well prepared for that. And
let me add something. I would say in your country, Singapore, you probably have a far less intrusive government, perhaps even from a financial perspective, than you do here. I mean, my sense is, in studying Asian cultures, is that there's a much greater sense of self-reliance, and I think that's something we've gotten away from in the United States.
Well, to some extent, I would just say that it really depends on the individual countries. Like Singapore, I can make a distinction just to share with you here, the distinction between Hong Kong and Singapore. First of all, Hong Kong is the place where I was born. I migrated to Singapore some 24 years ago. So I do see the sense of the reliance of the government from two places. Singapore is heavily, people like to rely on the government heavily, because over the years since the birth of Singapore, the government has provided all the infrastructure and needs to help the people. So naturally speaking, the Singaporeans would love the government's help. So that is what I see in Singapore. Whereas in Hong Kong, the situation is a bit different, because Hong Kong was used to be under British administration. So under the British administration, obviously, there's so much the government can do. So the Hong Kongers have learned over the years that no one is going to help me, so I've got to help myself. So I see a fine distinction between different parts of Asian countries. It's very interesting to see that. However, all in all, whether I'm from Singapore or Hong Kong, I learned over the years that I can't rely on the government anymore. I've got to do something to help myself, because when the financial crisis comes, who am I going to ask for help? Government? Who? I don't know. It must be me. So that is the natural instinct I have as a business owner. So I want the business owner to be aware also that financial crisis is just a part and parcel of the economic cycle. So the question is always that, are you ready for that? And if it comes, are you fully equipped so that you are able to survive in the business? And in some cases, you may even be thriving in the financial crisis. Who knows? So that is always my belief when I'm talking to my clients. So to conclude this interview, I always have this ritual, Jim. I'm always asking my guests to give me one quote of their choice, and Jim gave me this one. The mind, once expanded to the dimensions of larger ideas, never returns to his original size. So with this quote, how do you apply to your business or your personal life? Can you share with us on this?
Yeah, absolutely, Jack.
Sure.
I really like that quote because I'm a lifelong learner. I'm a voracious reader. So I'm always looking to expand my mind. And that's something that, at least in this country, I think we're plagued right now because as a nation, I don't think we're expanding our mind the way we really need to. And so part of my goal, if you will, as a nonfiction writer, even as a fiction writer, we didn't talk about my fiction books, but the fiction books and the nonfiction books are very intertwined. And even in my business, it's really all about teaching so people can learn and we can have, more intelligent, objective discussions about the problems of the day, whether they're political, financial, economic, whatever they may be. But it's very, very difficult to have objective, reasoned discussions unless you have a mind that has been expanded to have those types of discussions. And so that's why it's really important for people, whether you read my stuff or anyone else's, to become educated, because those educated minds, and this has nothing to do with whether you've been to college or not. I mean, you've got a myriad of resources available to you, in public libraries, the internet. I give away some of my books sometimes that's available for people to learn. And so without that knowledge, it becomes really, really hard to come up with these collective solutions that I think we need for political and economic and even social problems.
Yep, that's very important. And you also mentioned a very nice phrase, the lifelong learners. To me, life is finite, but learning is unlimited as long as you're still alive. So therefore, I always believe that I've got so much that I still need to learn. And I always tell people that I'm still a student of life. That is, unfortunately or fortunately, the name of the game right now. So thank you, Jim, for sharing with us the wisdom. And how will my audience be able to look for you?
Yeah, my author site is at jimmosquera.com. So that's JIMMOSQUERA.com. My business site is at sentinelconsulting.biz. So that's SENTINEL consulting.biz. And again, that's the consulting practice we talked about. JimMosquera.com has all of my published work, both fiction and nonfiction, and even some audiobooks in there as well.
Yep, I'll rest assured that be the first one to check out more about what you have written, because I believe that with that motivation, my audiences would love to check out the educational information that you have provided on your website. So really, thank you, Jim, for sharing with us your wisdom, your intelligence, and your experiences in what you do. And I thank you so much for giving us a very good insight of what's happening in the United States of America. You know what? It's good to always learn from people who are there to share with us what's going on.
Yeah, Jack, it's been great being on the show with you today.
Yep, thank you very much. So that concludes another episode of Cracking the Entrepreneur Code. So let's look forward to the next episode where I will again bring on another successful entrepreneur to share with you his wisdom, his insight, and his intelligence. So until we next meet, bye for now.
To continue cracking the entrepreneur code, subscribe for more episodes and download the Amazon bestseller, Cracking the Entrepreneur Code, 7 Tips to Build the Business You Always Wanted at crackingentrepreneur.com. Learn more about author and host Jack H.M. Wong and book your 30-minute discovery session to overcome any professional challenge at jackhmwong.com/apply.